The ground was soaked in a pool of dark crimson, the scent of iron heavy in the air. The figure in the garden was still, unnaturally so, their limbs twisted in a grotesque way, as though nature itself had rejected their presence. The roses, black as midnight, had bloomed around them, their petals sharp as daggers, their color stark against the blood-soaked soil. A scream, muffled by the distance, echoed through the stillness, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The gardener, once so meticulous, now lay motionless, their face contorted in a silent scream, eyes wide in disbelief. The garden had always been their sanctuary, their escape, but today it had become a tomb. How did this happen? The voice was shaky, coming from somewhere behind the garden's overgrown hedges. The answer would never be clear, for the roses, those black roses, held secrets darker than anyone could have imagined. A soft breath broke the silence, followed by the rustling of leaves. The person in the background stepped forward, their footsteps hesitant but sure. They approached the body slowly, their face a mask of disbelief, barely visible in the dim moonlight. Their breath hitched as they knelt beside the gardener, their hand hovering over the still form, afraid to touch it, yet compelled by something they couldn't name. The black roses seemed to surround them, closer now, as though they were drawing in the living. This isn't real," the voice whispered, shaking. But it was real. The blood was real. The roses were real. And the garden, now a graveyard, was real. But what had happened here? What had caused this brutal end? The answer was already beginning to reveal itself, hidden deep in the soil, beneath the roses, waiting for someone to discover it. The person slowly lowered their hand, the fingers brushing against the gardener's wrist. Cold. Lifeless. A shudder ran down their spine, and they recoiled, as if the touch had burned them. A feeling of wrongness hung in the air. The roses around them seemed to pulse, the darkness of the petals growing deeper, more intense. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a simple death. The blood, the roses, the unnatural stillness, they were all connected. The ground beneath them shifted slightly, and the person staggered back, their heart racing. Was it possible that the answers they sought were already here, hidden in the garden itself? The roses seemed to beckon, their dark beauty both alluring and terrifying. Something was waiting for them, buried beneath the surface, something that would explain the gardener's fate. But were they ready to uncover it? The ground shifted again, and the person stumbled backward, their breath catching in their throat. The roses, those black roses, began to move, their petals curling and unfurling in slow, deliberate motions, as if they were alive. The garden had never felt so alive, so filled with energy, but it was a dark, malevolent energy. The person looked around, their eyes wild, searching for something to explain the sudden shift. The air was thick, almost choking, and they could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on them. The roses, they were not just flowers. They were a part of the garden's secret, a secret the gardener had known and had perhaps tried to escape. But now, it was too late. The roses were closing in, and so were the answers. The person took one last frightened glance at the gardener's body before turning and running. But the roses, as if sensing their movement, seemed to shift, blocking their path, closing in tighter. The garden, once a sanctuary, was now a prison. They reached the edge of the garden, but it was as though the ground itself was unwilling to release them. They were trapped. The roses had come alive, and they were part of something far greater and more sinister than they had realized. "What is this place?" they whispered, their voice cracking. But the answer was simple, and it had been there all along, hidden in the garden, waiting for the right moment. And now that moment had come. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the once lush garden now marked by the blood-stained earth. The figure who had stumbled across the gardener's body, still shaken by the horrors they had witnessed, walked slowly through the garden. They had returned, unwilling to leave the mystery unsolved, but the dread of what lay within the garden's dark embrace was still heavy in their chest. Each step they took seemed to echo in their mind. "I shouldn't have come back," they whispered to themselves, but it was too late to turn back now. The roses, black, dark as the night, were everywhere, surrounding the place like an eerie fortress. They had seen the roses blooming before, but never like this. Never in this nightmare. The past few days weighed heavily on their mind, the memories of a life that once seemed normal, a life now fractured by secrets that had been long buried, a life of shadows, both inside and out. The air was thick, and with every breath, the weight of the garden pressed down on them. As they moved further into the maze of overgrown flowers and vines, memories began to flood their thoughts. The faces of loved ones, the laughter shared, and the life they once knew seemed so distant now. It was all gone, replaced by this, the black roses, the blood, and the silence that followed. What happened to me? They thought, running their fingers through the petals of a nearby rose. It felt cold, unnaturally so. What happened to us? Their voice cracked, almost in disbelief. They had been running from something for so long, but they weren't sure what it was anymore. What had they been so afraid of? The roses. Perhaps they were part of the answer. Perhaps they had been part of the secret the garden had always been keeping, and the gardener knew it. Perhaps the answer was buried somewhere deep within the soil, waiting to be uncovered. A sudden noise, a rustle in the bushes, startled them, breaking the heavy silence. Heart racing, they turned toward the sound, but saw nothing. The feeling of being watched crept over them, and they couldn't shake it. Every movement, every rustle of the leaves felt like an omen, a warning. As they walked deeper into the garden, the oppressive atmosphere thickened. The path ahead was dark, shrouded in the shadows of the black roses. I should leave. I should just walk away, they thought, but something kept them rooted to the spot. Something urged them forward. It was as if the garden itself were calling them, guiding them, leading them into the heart of its secrets. I can't turn back, they whispered, their voice barely audible. The roses were no longer just plants. They were sentient, alive, and they were waiting for something, or someone. Suddenly, a flash of movement in the corner of their vision caught their attention. Their heart skipped a beat as they spun around, but the garden remained still, the only movement coming from the wind stirring the leaves. A voice, soft and haunting, whispered through the air, but they couldn't quite make out the words. It was like a song, a lullaby, but it had a dark undertone, almost as if it were calling them, beckoning them deeper into the garden. They took a hesitant step forward. The feeling of being drawn into something unknown, grew stronger. What is it? They thought, desperate for an answer. What am I supposed to find? Their legs moved before their mind could stop them, leading them further into the labyrinth of roses. Each petal seemed to vibrate with an eerie energy, and the garden felt more like a living entity than a place. The roses were no longer just a part of the landscape. They were the very heartbeat of the garden itself, and the protagonist was walking right into its pulse. As they ventured deeper into the garden, the whispering grew louder, clearer. It was no longer just a sound in the wind. It was real, tangible, a presence that seemed to follow them. The words they could almost make out sent chills down their spine. Find the truth. The roses will show you. The roses, were they the key? The thought lingered in their mind like a question they couldn't answer. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted again, and they stumbled, nearly losing their balance. The roses seemed to close in around them, their petals brushing against their skin, their presence suffocating. I have to know, they murmured, more to themselves than to anyone else. They reached forward, pulling aside a cluster of dark petals, and their heart stopped. Beneath the roses there was something buried in the soil. Something, someone, was waiting to be found. As they unearthed the object hidden beneath the roses, the air grew still. The faint glimmer beneath the dark soil wasn't metal or stone. It was fabric, old and frayed. The protagonist's heart raced as they tugged it free, revealing an old, tattered journal. Pages inside were brittle, the ink faded, but the words still held a terrifying weight. It wasn't just any journal. It belonged to the gardener, the very person whose death had started this nightmare. The pages spoke of strange dreams, dark warnings, and cryptic messages about the roses, how they had always been more than mere flowers, more than just decoration. The roses are alive, the gardener had written. They are watching. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The gardener had known. They had been trying to warn someone, anyone, but now it was too late. The roses were not just flowers. They were something far darker, something that had been manipulating the garden, and the people around it, long before anyone had noticed. The more they read, the more the words began to make sense. Too much sense. The gardener had written about a pact, a deal made long ago to keep the roses growing, to keep them fed. But it came with a cost. The roses fed on life itself, on memories, on souls. The garden wasn't just a place of beauty. It was a trap, a prison for the spirits of the lost. The gardener had tried to escape it, to sever the bond. But each time they tried, the roses only grew stronger, feeding off their fear, their despair. The roses were not bound by time. They were eternal, and they fed on the living just as much as the dead. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. The protagonist had to get out, had to stop whatever dark force had taken root in the garden before it consumed them too. But how could they leave when the very soil seemed to hold them captive, when the roses seemed to sense their every move, their every thought? Suddenly, a cold gust of wind stirred the roses, sending them into a violent swaying motion. The once still garden erupted with movement, the petals of the black roses fluttering like wings. A low hum filled the air, rising to a deafening pitch. The ground beneath them trembled, and the protagonist stumbled back in horror. "No," they gasped, their voice barely above a whisper. It was happening. The garden was awakening. The roses, no, the garden itself, was alive, and it was angry. The black roses had been feeding, growing stronger with every passing day, every whispered secret, every unspoken fear. And now they were turning on the protagonist, aware of their presence and the danger they posed. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the roses closed in, moving as though they had a will of their own. The protagonist's breath came in ragged gasps as they turned to flee, but the garden seemed to shift and contort, trapping them in its grasp. Frantic, they tried to run, but the garden twisted and shifted, every turn leading them further into the maze of roses. The sound of their own heartbeat was deafening as they sprinted, dodging thorns and tangled vines. The roses seemed to reach out for them, their petals sharp as knives, their thorns tearing at their skin. "Why won't you leave me alone?" they shouted. But the garden was silent, its answer only the hum of its ever-growing power. They reached a clearing, only to find it filled with the same black roses, the same oppressive air. They were trapped. There was no escape. The roses had closed off every exit, every possible way out. The garden was a prison, and the more they fought, the tighter the walls became. "I have to stop it," they whispered to themselves, their breath ragged. But how could they stop something that was alive, that was feeding on them, on their fear, their every move? In the midst of the chaos, something caught their eye, a faint glimmer of light through the mass of roses. It was coming from the center of the garden, where the roses were most concentrated. Without thinking, they headed toward it, pushing through the thick vines and petals. The closer they got, the more intense the feeling of dread became. The roses were closing in around them, almost as though they were protecting something, something at the heart of the garden. The light grew brighter as they reached the center, and there, in the middle of a clearing, lay a stone altar covered in dark roses. On the altar, a strange object glowed faintly, something that seemed to be the source of the garden's power. The protagonist's hands trembled as they reached out to touch it, knowing that doing so could either destroy the garden or complete its curse. There was no turning back now. Whatever choice they made would change everything. The moment their hand touched the glowing object on the altar, the garden seemed to hold its breath. The roses stilled, their petals no longer twitching, their thorns retreating slightly. The faint light grew brighter, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm, as if the garden itself had recognized their presence. The protagonist's breath hitched. They had expected something, but not this. The object, an ornate pendant, lay before them, its intricate design almost hypnotic. As their fingers curled around it, A deep, resonating voice echoed in their mind, familiar, yet foreign. "I knew you would come," it whispered. "It's always been you." The words sent a chill down their spine. It was the gardener's voice, but distorted, corrupted by something far darker. The realization hit them with crushing force. The gardener had not been a victim, they had been the architect of this nightmare. The roses, the curse, everything. It was all part of a plan. The garden had been waiting for them. The pendant's light began to shift, as if it were responding to the protagonist's touch. The hum of the garden grew louder, more intense. In a sudden blinding flash, the protagonist was thrown backward, landing hard on the ground. When their vision cleared, they found themselves in a different part of the garden, one they had never seen before. The trees here were blackened, their bark twisted and warped, and the roses, darker than ever, were everywhere, suffocating the space. The ground beneath them had turned to cracked stone, covered in ash. Standing before them was the gardener, alive, but not as they remembered. The gardener's eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light, their once familiar face now twisted in a grotesque smile. "You were always meant to come here," the gardener said, their voice hollow, detached. "The roses called you. And now, you belong to them." The garden seemed to hum with life as the gardener stepped forward, their movements slow but purposeful. "You think you were the one to uncover the truth," the gardener continued, their voice a mixture of amusement and malice. "The roses have always been more than plants. They were my creation, my gift, and my curse." They lifted a hand, and the roses around them responded, their petals curling inward, as if listening to a command. "I made a deal, one I could not escape. And when I realized the cost, it was already too late. The roses were already feeding, and I had no choice but to serve them. But now I can finally break free. And so can you." The garden shifted again, the ground beneath them trembling as the roses began to sway violently. The protagonist's stomach churned. "You never escaped," they said, barely above a whisper. "You've become one with them." The gardener's cruel smile widened, and they stepped closer to the protagonist, who was struggling to rise. "It's too late to run. The roses already know you. They've been watching you from the moment you stepped into this garden. They've been feeding on your fear, your confusion." The roses seemed to close in around them, their petals brushing the protagonist's skin. The protagonist's heart raced as they realized the truth. The garden was not just a place of beauty, it was a prison. The roses were the wardens, and the gardener had been the keeper, bound by a pact far older than they could have imagined. "You were always meant to replace me," the gardener whispered, their voice chilling. "But I will not let you take my place. The roses are mine. They belong to me." A final command left the gardener's lips, and the roses responded, their petals growing sharper, their thorns reaching toward the protagonist. The protagonist could feel the roses pressing in on them, the thorns scratching their skin, drawing blood. Panic rose in their chest, but then amidst the chaos, a flicker of realization flashed. The pendant, the source of the garden's power, it was not just a key to the garden's curse, it was also the key to breaking it. The roses had fed on the gardener's soul, but the pendant was the catalyst. If they could use it, they could reverse the pact. They fought against the pain, reached for the pendant, and gripped it tightly. "I'm not your replacement," they said, through gritted teeth. "I'm the one who ends this." The garden trembled as the power of the pendant surged through their body. The roses recoiled, their petals withering in the light. The gardener's expression faltered for a moment, disbelief flickering in their glowing eyes. The protagonist held the pendant high, and with all their strength, forced the garden to face its reckoning. The garden trembled violently, its heartbeat matching the protagonist's racing pulse. The pendant, now glowing with a fierce, blinding light, pulsed in their hand. The roses, no longer just flowers, but twisted, sentient creatures, writhed in agony, their petals burning with the intense energy that surged through the pendant. "You can't stop this," the gardener snarled, their voice warped with fury. The roses will always claim what they desire. They will never let you go. The protagonist could feel the weight of their words, but in their heart, they knew this was the moment. They had come too far to back down now. "I'm not afraid anymore," they whispered, barely audible. With one final desperate breath, they raised the pendant higher, directing the full force of its power into the heart of the garden. The roses screamed, their beauty becoming grotesque as they recoiled from the light, and the air itself seemed to shudder. The garden was collapsing. The ground cracked open beneath them, fissures spreading across the stone, and the roses screamed, no longer in pain, but in rage. The pendant's light grew brighter, stronger, but the gardener refused to yield. With a shout, they reached out, their hands trembling as they tried to snatch the pendant away. "You don't understand," they cried. "This power is mine. I made the deal, and now it's my right to control it." But the protagonist stood firm, their grip on the pendant unyielding. The earth trembled again, and a deep, guttural sound erupted from the ground. The roots of the roses began to stir, reaching for the light. It was as if the garden itself was trying to reclaim what it had lost. "It ends now," the protagonist whispered, feeling the surge of energy coursing through them, fueling their resolve. The pendant's power was no longer just a tool. It was a weapon. The garden seemed to scream as the light of the pendant consumed it, but there was no turning back now. The roses, their dark beauty twisted into something monstrous, were being torn apart. Petals fell like ash, their sweet fragrance now replaced with the stench of decay. The gardener screamed in fury, but their voice was lost in the chaos. The power of the pendant surged, and the garden's hold on the protagonist began to fade. The vines loosened, the roots retreated, and the earth no longer felt like a prison. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the protagonist could breathe. But even as the garden began to crumble, they knew that they had not yet won. The roses, as much as they had fed on fear, were now feeding on something else, their own anger. And in that fury, the garden was about to lash out one final time. With a final violent burst of light, the pendant erupted in a flash so bright that the protagonist was forced to shield their eyes. The earth shook, the ground cracked open beneath them, and for a moment, the world seemed to go silent. When the light faded, the garden was no longer the lush, eerie place it had once been. The roses, once vibrant and dark, were now withered and lifeless. The vines that had twisted and contorted around the protagonist were now nothing more than brittle, dead stalks. The gardener, who had once stood so tall, now lay crumpled on the ground, their power broken. The air felt still, as though the garden was finally at peace. But the protagonist knew that the victory had come at a cost. The pendant, now dull and lifeless, slipped from their hand. It was over. The garden was gone. The roses had been defeated. But at what price? The silence that followed was deafening. The protagonist looked around at the decimated garden, the remnants of something beautiful and cursed. The roses, once so powerful, were now just twisted memories. They had been freed, but at the expense of the garden, and perhaps their own soul. "I didn't want this," they whispered, their voice breaking. They had come here to solve a mystery, to escape the darkness that had plagued them for so long. But now, in the aftermath, they realized the true cost of their journey. The roses had fed on their fear, their memories, their very essence. They had been part of the garden all along, whether they knew it or not. And as the protagonist turned to leave, a thought lingered in their mind. Was the garden truly gone, or had it merely changed shape? The path ahead seemed unclear, but they knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they were no longer the same person who had first stepped into the garden. The protagonist walked alone in the empty field, their steps slow and deliberate, as if each movement carried the weight of everything that had happened. The garden, once a place of terror, was no more. In its place, there was only silence, a stillness that seemed unnatural after the chaos. The pendant, now just an inert object, hung loosely in their hand, the faint glow it once held completely gone. They had defeated the garden's curse, but something inside them was broken. They had taken down the darkness, but it had left its mark. The roses, those black roses, had fed on something more than fear. They had fed on memories, on pieces of the soul. The protagonist knew they would never be the same. "What now?" they whispered into the wind. They had no answers, only questions. And as the wind swept through the field, carrying with it the faint scent of roses, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were not done yet, that something still lingered in the shadows. As the protagonist continued to walk, they felt the presence of something familiar, something from the garden still clung to them. The memories of the roses, of the garden's haunting beauty, whispered at the edges of their mind. It was as if the garden had never truly let go of them. The wind picked up again, swirling around their body, and they froze. "Is it over?" they whispered, their voice trembling. The once clear sky above them darkened momentarily, and the distant sound of a whisper reached their ears, too soft to understand. Was it the garden? Or was it just their mind, torturing them with remnants of what had happened? They stopped, breath caught in their throat. "I can't run from it anymore," they realized. The garden had been a part of them, just as much as they had been a part of it. There was no escaping what had transpired. They had to face the consequences now, whatever they might be. The whispers became louder, clearer, until the protagonist could no longer ignore them. They turned around, searching the empty field for the source. There was nothing, only the remnants of the garden, now reduced to rubble. But as their gaze fell upon the spot where the garden had once thrived, they noticed something new, an unusual mark in the soil, an impression that wasn't there before. The ground was cracked, but something had been left behind, a symbol etched into the earth. It was small, subtle, yet undeniably familiar. It was the same symbol that had appeared in the gardener's journal, the same mark that had haunted their dreams. The realization hit them all at once. "It's not gone," they whispered to themselves. "It's not finished." The garden had left a part of itself behind, just as it had left its mark on the gardener. Now, it was their turn to face the truth. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The protagonist stood, the weight of the symbol pressing down on them. It felt like the earth itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. The garden had been destroyed, but its influence remained. "I thought I could end this," they said softly, their voice shaking. "I thought I could walk away." But they knew now that the garden, the roses, the curse, they were all part of something much larger than they had ever imagined. They had come to the garden seeking answers, seeking an end. But what they had found instead was the beginning of a much darker journey. The symbol in the soil pulsed with energy, and the wind seemed to carry whispers from the past. The protagonists knew they couldn't leave it like this, couldn't walk away without confronting what had been left behind. "I have to finish this," they said with newfound resolve. They turned toward the horizon, their path now clear. Whatever came next, they would face it head on. As they walked away, the symbol's glow slowly faded, but its presence remained in the back of their mind, a reminder of the garden's true power. The roses may have been destroyed, but the curse lingered, tied to the very earth they stood on. The protagonist didn't know what awaited them, but they knew one thing for certain: they could never go back to who they were before. The person who had first stepped into that garden, seeking answers, was gone. They had been forged in the fires of the garden's terror and mystery. Now they were a part of something bigger, something far more complex than they had ever imagined. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they would face it, because they had no choice. The roses may have been defeated, but the darkness still had its hold on the world. And as the protagonist walked into the distance, they realized that this was only the beginning. The true test had yet to come. Days passed, and the protagonist found themselves far from the garden. The world seemed quieter, the air lighter, yet something in their soul had shifted. The world outside felt hollow, as though it had been untouched by time. But within, the garden's shadows still clung to them. The roses, the curse, they had been vanquished, or so they had believed. Yet, A strange sense of unease settled in their chest. The whispers, once faint, had started again. Soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. "It's never truly gone," they murmured to themselves, staring into the distance. They could no longer deny it. The garden's reach had extended far beyond the soil and the roses. The garden had been a reflection of something deeper, something more profound. And now, as they stood on the edge of a new chapter, the darkness still followed them, like a shadow they could never escape. As the protagonist walked further, the weight of the past tugged at them like an invisible chain. The whispers grew louder now, forming coherent words, threatening, enticing, and ultimately familiar. "You thought it was over, didn't you?" The voice was deep, hollow, and cold, sending a chill down their spine. It felt like the garden was speaking directly to them, as if it had never truly been defeated. The pendant, now a dull, lifeless object, had been left behind in the ruins of the garden, but its presence was still felt. "You belong to it," the voice hissed. The protagonist stopped dead in their tracks, the air growing colder, heavier. They turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the endless open space, the wind gently rustling the grass. But deep inside they knew, whatever had been left behind in that cursed garden was far from gone. It had only been dormant, waiting for the right moment. Suddenly, a flash of light, almost blinding in its intensity, erupted in the sky. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat as they shielded their eyes from the searing brightness. As the light faded, they found themselves back at the garden's edge, the very place they had once stood in fear. The roses, now gone, had left an eerie stillness in their wake. But something felt off. The ground was undisturbed, the air unnaturally silent. Yet, there was a presence here, a lingering force that stretched beyond the physical. It was like the garden itself had marked them, an invisible thread binding them to the place. The protagonist looked around, half expecting the garden to rise up from the earth once more. But nothing moved. The silence was absolute. And in that silence, they felt the pulse of something ancient, waiting, watching. The air was thick with expectation. The garden had not vanished. It had merely retreated, biding its time. With a sense of finality, the protagonist took a deep breath and turned their back on the garden. They had spent so much time trapped in its cycle, unable to break free from its influence. But they were ready now, ready to move on, to reclaim their life from the shadow that had haunted them. The whispers faded, barely audible now, as they took each step further away from the garden. They walked without looking back, knowing that no matter what happened, they had broken the curse, severed the ties that had bound them. But the garden, with all its power, would never let go completely. It had left a mark on them, a scar that would never fade. "I will not be defined by it," the protagonist muttered under their breath. They had faced the darkness. And now, they would face the light. The future was uncertain, but they would meet it with courage. The garden was behind them, but its legacy would live on in the form of the lessons they had learned. As they walked, the path ahead grew clearer. The world stretched out before them, vast and open, but they could still feel the faintest tug of the garden's memory. The roses had been defeated, the curse broken, but they knew that some things couldn't be fully erased. The past, with all its pain and mystery, had shaped them. And now, as they reached the edge of a new dawn, they could feel the weight of their journey lifting. A breath, slow and deliberate, escaped their lips. They had survived the darkness, and now they would survive the light. But one thing was certain, they would never forget what they had faced. The garden, with all its horrors, had been a part of them, and no matter where they went, that part would always remain. And so, as they stepped forward into the unknown, they whispered softly, "It's over, for now."